You found a city you want to live in. You've done the research, checked the commute times, visited the neighborhoods. You make a list of apartments and start sending applications. Then something strange happens. Every unit you contact already has dozens of competing applications. The ones that are available disappear before you can schedule a tour. Every offer you make comes back rejected, not because your application was weak, but because many others made stronger ones. And the rents somehow seem to have gone up between the moment you first looked and the moment you tried to sign. You start asking, what is actually going on here? But here's the real question, is this bad luck? Or are you watching something that has happened before in cities you've never lived in to people you'll never meet? The housing squeeze feels intensely local. It feels like your city, your neighborhood, your particular bad timing. But the same sequence has played out in growing cities across different countries and different economic eras. The specific rents change. The political language around it changes. Who gets blamed changes. But the shape of the squeeze, how it starts, how it escalates, which people it displaces first and last, follows a pattern so consistent that once you recognize it, you can trace it backward in cities you've never visited and predict it forward in cities that are just starting to grow. This isn't a political argument. It isn't about who to blame. It's about the underlying mechanism that generates a housing squeeze wherever people gather in large enough numbers to need a city. The pattern is older than any living generation clearly remembers. In every era when a city has grown faster than its housing stock, the same sequence followed. Newcomers arrived and competed for existing units. Prices rose. The people who arrived in the last wave, now settled in, complained about the disruption caused by the next wave coming after them. Local governments responded by trying to manage the visible symptoms: overcrowding, rent pressure, neighborhood change. But not the cause that was harder to see, not enough units. And the cities that eventually worked through their housing squeezes didn't do it through any single bold intervention. They did it by changing the relationship between how fast demand arrived and how fast housing could be added. The cities that didn't change that relationship kept experiencing the same squeeze over and over again. Here is how the housing squeeze actually works, stripped of ideology. Demand for housing in desirable cities arrives in waves. A major employer expands. A region earns a reputation for a particular quality of life. Workers from a more expensive city begin looking nearby for somewhere they can afford. Demand can respond to these signals within weeks. A person needs housing now, and they will pay what they have to pay to get it. Housing supply, however, responds to signals over years because of what construction actually requires. A decision to finance, followed by entitlements and permits, followed by design and engineering, followed by acquiring labor and materials, followed by the time it takes to actually build. The gap between those two response speeds, weeks for demand, years for supply, is where the squeeze lives. When more people want each unit than there are units available, prices rise. Not because anyone decided to raise them. Now here is what makes the squeeze self-perpetuating rather than self-correcting. As prices rise, every existing homeowner's net worth climbs with them. They now have a direct financial stake in the continuation of housing scarcity. And because homeowners vote in higher numbers, show up at local planning meetings, and have stable addresses while renters move frequently, they exert disproportionate influence over the decisions that control new supply. Zoning rules, height limits, parking minimums, environmental review timelines. None of this requires conspiracy. It only requires that people act in their economic self-interest, as people reliably do. The result is that the cities most acutely affected by a housing squeeze are also the cities most politically resistant to the supply-side response. The squeeze doesn't just persist, it gets encoded into the rules of the city, making each cycle harder to break than the last. At this point, you've probably heard a different set of explanations for why housing costs what it does. Speculators are buying up homes and leaving them empty. Short-term rentals have converted residential units into tourism inventory. Corporate landlords are acquiring entire neighborhoods. Foreign capital is parking itself in real estate with no intention of housing anyone. These things are real. What most people miss is that they are secondary effects, not the primary engine. They exist on top of a pre-existing supply shortfall. They redirect its costs, concentrate them on specific communities, and generate justifiable anger. But in cities that have genuinely eased the supply constraint, these secondary pressures have proven manageable. In cities where supply remains locked, removing every speculator and every short-term rental listing wouldn't meaningfully change the fundamental scarcity underneath. Consider a city that has been growing for years. Its housing stock was built for a smaller population and has not caught up. Rents rise steadily, not dramatically in any single year, but persistently. Workers who arrived when rents were lower stay in their units as long as they possibly can, because leaving means entering a market with nowhere for them to go. Turnover falls. Vacancy rates drop close to zero. New arrivals face a market where almost nothing is available. The workers the city depends on to function, teachers, nurses, drivers, maintenance workers, begin commuting from farther and farther away, or they leave entirely. For example, imagine watching that shift happen to a neighborhood you've lived in for years, as the people you know are gradually replaced not by anyone's intention, but by a price mechanism working exactly as designed. So the practical takeaway is this: the housing squeeze doesn't end when demand cools. Demand always returns to cities that offer what people want. Cities that stop growing have a different, more serious problem. The squeeze ends when supply becomes capable of responding to demand fast enough to absorb incoming waves before they become sustained price pressure. That requires changing not just what eventually gets built, but how quickly the permission to build gets granted. The cities that have done this, that have made adding housing the default rather than the exception, have not solved every housing problem, but they have interrupted the cycle. They stop the pattern from compounding decade after decade into something that permanently reshapes who gets to live where. Go back to that apartment you couldn't get. The reason so many people were competing for it isn't bad luck. It isn't the result of one single policy failure or one identifiable villain. It is the output of a gap between demand and supply, a gap that opened over years, got encoded into zoning codes and political habits, and gets sustained by the financial interests of people who already own. The pattern behind every housing squeeze is the same pattern, across cities that have almost nothing else in common. Once you can see the mechanism, the specific headlines become less important than understanding what generates them. You're not watching a series of individual crises. You're watching one cycle repeat in different cities at different points in its arc.